The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Children and adults love stories, and today our guest is Jim Latimer, master storyteller and author. He'll be joined by musician Laura MacKenzie and dancer Amanda Zaeska. They'll be interpreting Jim's books, Bear the Goose Gathering and The Irish Piper, through words, music, and dance. Jim and Laura, it's a pleasure to have you here today. We don't often have the opportunity to talk not only about books, but about music, and even have the opportunity to hear some music. Jim, as an author of books for young people, I think you're a natural storyteller. I've watched you with young children, and they're mesmerized. I think the book and the illustrations almost become secondary to the sound of your voice as you tell the story. You use a lot of humor. There's a lot of, I think, very childlike logic, and I don't mean that in a demeaning manner, but children are very, very practical, very logical people, and you bring this out so well in your books, Going the Moose Way Home, and a couple of your newer books, Bear and the Goose Gathering, and Moose and Friends. And you've gone from writing the traditional sort of book to writing and having that book illustrated, and then enhancing your book and the story through the use of music. And that's where Laura and later on Amanda come in. How did this all start?
Well, it's a temptation I feel quite sure no writer could resist if once it came. It is great fun to tell stories with Laura and Amanda, doing music and dancing. And we've figured out ways to sneak the music into the stories even when it wasn't there to begin with. You'll see.
Well, reading your books, there is a theme of music. There's humming, and it's quiet and it's gentle, and sometimes the music works the magic with the characters, and sometimes it doesn't. Your story, The Irish Piper, of course, is similar to the old story of the Pied Piper of Hamlin.
Yes.
You've set it in a different country, a different way of looking at the whole story, and you've brought a large version of the book to.
We do have a retelling of the story, The Pied Piper of Hamlin, and this is a portrait of the piper, who also plays the wooden flute, and it's also a portrait of Laura, and of course I'm there in the picture too.
It is, as I look close, definitely.
It's me, huh? This version of the story includes a lot of exaggeration and anachronism, and there are plays on words, alliteration, and so forth. But it also includes the quite sincere speculation that the music that charmed the children in Hamlin back in the 13th century, and the music that charmed the rats, was Irish music. Well,
we whose ethnic background is partly Irish always like to hear things like that.
I don't see why not. It is an old tale, and some people think at least partly true, but we don't, if there was a piper, we don't know who he was or who she was, or whether it was a woman or a man, and we don't know what the music was. So this version of the story answers those questions, I think.
So when you go in to tell the story in the schools or with groups of children, Laura is here with some instruments, and do you talk to the children about the instruments and what they are and where they came from before you do the story?
We do. That's right. I get to introduce Laura and her wonderful instruments. She plays several rare and precious instruments that kids mostly haven't seen before. For example, this is a 19th century wooden concert flute. It is the type of flute that was preferred for chamber music and and classical music 150 years ago. And it is the ancestor of the modern silver flute, but it has a different fingering system and a different blowing approach too, and it has a different sound. And so usually I begin by asking Laura to play a little bit just so kids can see and hear what this wooden flute sounds like. Could you play a little?
Certainly.
There's definitely a lilt there. Is that Irish music? Did you compose it? Is something traditional folk music?
That's part of a traditional Irish reel, a dance tune.
So when you were talking about the kind of music you wanted to use to help tell the story of the Irish piper, how did you go about choosing?
Picking the tunes?
Picking the tunes, yes.
That's Laura's job. In fact, she won't stand for me to interfere with the picking of the tunes usually.
Well, I was pretty much gathered by the tone of the story. Told me, what to play. For instance, there's a strong march, and there's bird music, as you'll hear. So I just tried to pick traditional tunes that had a flavor that matched the story.
Sounds like you have a wide knowledge of some of those traditional tunes. Where did you learn this?
Well, I learned my first traditional Irish tunes from Irish musicians living in St. Paul. There are some very fine ones, but then I've also spent a lot of time in Ireland and Scotland learning traditional music.
Are you going to do some composing of your own, or do you build on the kind of music that you hear and it just sort of flows naturally?
Well, I do write a few tunes now and then, but they are not terribly traditional sounding. I wouldn't try to write traditional tunes because there are thousands of wonderful tunes already floating around, and more than I could ever learn in a lifetime that I'd like to learn. So
this is also a way of preserving some of those traditional tunes and bringing them to the awareness of children and their families through the stories that Jim is writing and you're telling together.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jim, I think, tell us a story.
Okay. Well, we say that the piper came from Clare in the west of Ireland, and she played music so vivid and so thrilling it would charm animals and children, which was lucky for the folks in Hamlin in Germany because they had too many of one kind of animal there. And this was back in the 13th century, toward the end of the 13th century. And so the Irish piper's reputation reached all the way to Hamlin in Germany. And the mayor of Hamlin hired the piper, promised her jewelry and bracelets, a truckload of earrings if she wanted, and promised the piper her birthday would be a holiday in Hamlin, and promised that the best storyteller in Hamlin would make up a story and make the piper immortal if she would just help get rid of the Hamlin rats, which were, apart from being too numerous, they were also obnoxious creatures. They walked upright, for one thing, on their hind feet with their paws in their pockets, swaggering and strutting about and acting tough and chewing gum. And the rats all preferred sour-flavored bubble gum, and so they all suffered from sour breath, which made them even worse company than they might have been otherwise. So the piper agrees to try to charm the rats, and she plays for them first a sad tune to make them cry. So that's part of her reputation, it's that she plays music so sad it could make almost anyone cry. So she plays her sad music for the rats first. It sounded like this. Did the rats cry? I almost always ask the kids who are listening to this story. And by this stage in the story, they've heard the sad music at least once, and it is terribly sad, and most kids guess that it probably does make the rats cry. But the rats tell the piper, Probably the head rat says that music would make Irish rats cry. But we are German rats, and we are tough, and we chew sour-flavored bubblegum, and we never cry. But the head rat tells the piper that rats love to march. He says, there's hardly a rat anywhere who can resist a good march. Do you know a march? And the piper plays a march for the rats, and it sounds like this. We were just kidding, the head rat tells the piper. We do not like to march, and we don't like you either. In fact, we have heard of you, piper, and we have heard this story before. We're not going to follow you. So you can just go back home to Ireland or wherever you came from. But piper, before you go, since you've come all this way, the head rat tells her, we've heard you play music to imitate the singing of birds. In fact, you caused the magistrate in Hamlin to think he was a bird and to flap his arms and fly about. Could you just play your bird music for us, and then you can go home? So the piper plays her bird music for the rats. So the rats weren't impressed by the piper's sad music, and they didn't care about her march and hated it, in fact, and they weren't impressed by her bird music either. They tell her to go home, and yet she seems so sad. The head rat tells her, Piper, we don't want you to cry. Maybe, the head rat tells her, maybe we will send for you to play for us the next time there is a rat's birthday party. Do you play for parties? The head rat, of course, is being typically sarcastic and mean, but the piper pays no attention to his sarcasm. Instead, she plays for the rats a tune on the pipes, and the rats are so surprised by this music. Here's the music that charms the rats of Hamlin.
I imagine that charms the children as it's being tuned up.
Well,
Yes.
Sometimes when I'm telling the story with Laura, I say that the music makes the rats think of Irish cheese and rashers, and sometimes they clap their paws and dance to the music, and sometimes they chew their gum. They start to chew their gum unconsciously in time and in rhythm with the music. And the head rat says to his companions, he says, "You guys, this music is pretty good. It's the best gum chewing music I've ever heard. Let's follow her." And they do. And the mayor of Hamlin and her alderman and her magistrate are astonished that it has worked, that the rats have left town. And they praise the piper to the skies and shake her hands and wish her congratulations. And they tell her how pleased they are and how much they hope she'll stop by and see them again the next time she's passing through. But of course they've forgotten about their promise. Jewelry they've promised, and they tell her that their jeweler has just left town on his annual 2-week trip to Texas, so they can't get any jewelry for her. And her birthday is already a holiday in Hamlin. She can't have her birthday as a holiday. And the best storyteller in Hamlin is in a bad mood. And if this makes the piper angry, if she thinks that she will play her music and charm the Hamlin children and lead them away, well, she won't do that, because there are 500 children in Hamlin, and all of the 500 Hamlin children are brats. And they would be a piper's nightmare if a piper would imagine playing for 500 brats and traveling around the countryside. But the piper does find a tune that the Hamlin children like. And we often conclude the story by saying that the children follow the piper to the west of Ireland, because there in Clare, some Hamlin-looking children still dance to Irish music. And we have a Hamlin-looking child with us today, kind of grown up, who will show you what it looks like to dance to Irish music. And this will be a jig that Amanda will do to, and we're pretty sure this is the Irish jig that charmed the children of Hamlin. Good, huh?
Oh, it's wonderful, charming, and it must absolutely fascinate the children, the precision of the dance, the music. What do teachers think? The adults who watch this, have they seen the way you've incorporated, as you say, the anachronisms into the story, which must make it ever so much more appealing to kids today with the more sophisticated sense of humor?
Sometimes in 5th and 6th grade, I will talk about an anachronism and some of the things that happen in the story, and I share some other examples and suggest it as a creative writing activity to take an old tale and put some contemporary things, bubblegum or trips to Texas or so forth. And there are
Well, do you think sometimes we're too purist about the literature or the story, and we need to understand that stories have adapted over the centuries, and you've got to incorporate something to make them the kernel there, but more appealing to children today?
Do you know, in general, I think I feel kind of protective of the traditional stories and don't think it's such a good idea to tamper with them too much, and yet here I have tampered with the traditional story. But that's a tough question. And I think
Well, Browning was not necessarily.
Right.
It's not like taking Laura's traditional Irish music and modernizing it.
Right. If there was any danger of losing the traditional stories, folk and fairy tales, boy, I think I would stop. But on the other hand, what makes it comical and fun to do is we know these stories so well. I mean, when John Sheska, for example, does The Princess and the Bowling Ball, what makes that funny is because we already know the story of the Princess and the Peace so well. So I don't think he endangers that story so much. But at least I hope not. And I take the story of the Pied Piper of Hamlin quite seriously, and the fact that it has survived so many, many generations of telling and retelling. And I hope that at least I keep what is essential in there, and don't do it any harm.
Well, and you have changed the piper into a woman,
Yes.
and the burghers of the town
Right.
are women, which is an interesting twist to make it
Yes.
of some contemporary interest. When the children see you with those pipes, I think they probably know that they're like bagpipes, but they're really not. And is that a tin whistle that you use?
Yeah,
And
this is a tin whistle.
do you describe these to the children, or do you just use them and let them enjoy it that way?
Well, we describe them, and we also answer lots of questions about them. If we haven't explained properly how they work, they ask lots of very pointed questions, and they want to know exactly how. This is a bellows. It's a bellows-blown pipe rather than a mouth-blown bagpipe. Which
And you were
everyone
moving
is-
that by moving your
Yeah,
arm
you have
and
to
your
pump
elbow
the
at the same
pump
time.
the bellows with the one arm and squeeze the bag with the other to keep the air pressure constant. So they really want to know all the mechanics.
And the
how it
pipes
all
aren't as
works.
old as your flute.
No, not this set. This flute is actually from the mid-19th century, but this set of pipes was recently made, but they're copied after museum instruments in Scotland.
And where did you have to go to learn how to play those?
I went right to the pipe maker, who was also a pipe teacher. So I went right to the man who made these pipes to learn, because there isn't anyone in the Midwest that I know of anyway who plays this type of bagpipe.
So if someone is watching this program, eventually they will have to seek out instruction someplace else.
Well, probably, although they're getting more popular. There are more players and teachers around now than there were when I started.
And the same with Amanda's dancing. The Irish step dancing is a very old form of dancing, but I think there are places in the Twin Cities
There are.
where young people can take lessons.
There most definitely are. Amanda has a famous teacher, a world champion dancer from Kerry, whose name is Katie Griffin McCormick. So it is likely and possible to learn.
And sometimes at festivals, Festival of Nations or places in the community, we see children who are dancing often in elaborate costumes, and it's a wonderful way, again, of preserving another part of Minnesota's heritage.
Yes, indeed.
You have some more stories. In fact, I think the one we were talking about before we started the taping, James Bear and the Goose Gathering, has some, a word that's often used in reviews, whimsical illustrations. But here is the story of Bear, who has a sly little sense of humor, who is actually teasing some of his friends, the geese, and telling them that in the olden days they were dancers, they were singers, and he is so persuasive in his storytelling that actually some wonderful things happen. And I think the illustrations in the book are wonderful, but I am sure that the story you tell and Laura tells and Amanda tells would be even more fun than looking at the illustrations in the book.
This one I did since I started going out to schools with Laura and Amanda, and so I included opportunities for Laura to play some tunes and even Amanda to dance. In fact, we sometimes do this one with Amanda's choir. Amanda is Latvian by heritage, and she belongs to a wonderful Latvian folk ensemble. And so sometimes there's a choir in this story, so sometimes we get to do it with a whole choir. Should we do a...
Oh, please do.
Bear is his name is James, and he is a grazing bear. It means he eats grass all day long. It's his job. It's his living. And while cows seem mostly content to eat grass all day, it's a terribly boring thing to do when you're a bear. And so James does some other things to entertain himself and to give his teeth a rest. He plays rugby with the crickets and the caterpillars that live in the tall grass near him. And he is a singer and the only bear in the trout and cricket choir. And Bear's best friend Skunk is always skeptical about the things he does. Do you really play rugby with crickets, she asks him. I don't see how you could. You're too fat. What if you stepped on a cricket? And he always answers her, yes and no is his answer. She asked him, well, but do trout really sing? Because I don't see how a fish even has a voice or a throat. And Bear answers her that trout do sing in the trout and cricket choir. And Laura imitates this choir, and I sometimes tell the kids that if they listen very carefully, they can hear the trout part. She does the choir on the bellows pipes like this.
Just how I imagine trout singing. And what a wonderful way to end up the program with a...
Skunk warns Bear that he must not do it, must not tell stories to his neighbors, the geese, not tell them tall tales. But he can't help it, he can't stop himself. He tells the geese that their ancestors, their grandparents, were lovely dancers, and so it gives Amanda another chance to dance with us. So here's Amanda pretending she's a goose.
What a wonderful, elegant goose. Jim, Laura, and Amanda, thank you very, very much for a wonderful All About Kids.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Music, dance, and story. What a wonderful combination. Thank you, Jim Latimer, Laura MacKenzie, and Amanda Zaeska. And thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.